Welcome, everybody. So this, to start our year off, we had Dr. Johnsrude, who is here, obviously. Dr. Johnsrude is a clinical neuropsychologist who did her training with Brendan Mellor at Yale, and then spent 7 years in the UK as a Welcome Trust traveling fellow at University College, and then as a staff scientist at the Medical Research Council, Cognition and Brain Science Unit in Cambridge. Is that with Simon very home?
No, I was working with William Marsden.
Okay, a different person.
Psycholinguistics.
Okay. Psycholinguistics. What is psycholinguistics?
The cognitive study of language. So studying language from a very cognitive point of view.
So. Language is not different, is it?
That's a very good question.
We've had to many times. So anyway, after that, Dr. Johnsrude came back to Canada and was at Queen's, the Canada Research Chair, and came to Western and saw the light in 2014, and has used neuroimaging, EEG and fMRI, and psychoacoustic methods, and has over 100 peer-reviewed publications and 20,000 citations. So what's your H score?
49.
Impressive. And has won multiple awards for her research. So today, Dr. Johnsrude will be talking about language and how children learn through hearing voices.
Yes.
Real voices, not hallucinating ones. Oh, maybe.
Yeah, when I was putting this talk together, I was struggling to think about how to make it relevant. So what I've done is I've put a bunch of things together. It's a bit like chocolate box. And I'll just start. And if there are things that particularly interest you, then we'll pursue. Otherwise, I'll go through it quickly and we'll move on to the next chocolate in the box. So I'm very interested in, well, before I get into that, I'll just remind you what the learning objectives are, because they were learning objectives. So how knowledge can facilitate perception of noisy and ambiguous speech. Be able to talk about how speech can be demanding, mentally and cognitively demanding, either because it's noisy or linguistically because it contains words or structures that are hard to process. And I'm going to talk about listening effort, which may not be something that you encounter routinely, although I don't know, maybe it might. I mean, listening effort has become very popular in audiology circles because it might explain variability in behavior. To this point, it's still a rather poorly articulated concept. I think we all have a sense for what listening ever is, and you have to work to understand what somebody's saying in the environment space. It's so easy for a restaurant, for example. And it explains, as I said, differences in behavior. So you might have two people who have the same, who are wearing hearing aids and have the same intelligibility score. You give them hearing tests and they do exactly the same. One of them thinks, this is great, I can hear with this hearing aid, I'm going to wear it all the time. The other one, though, is finding the effort required to achieve that level of performance just too tiring. And so they choose to maybe not wear their aid, or they choose not to engage socially because it's just too effort. So you can have very similar behavior in terms of performance and hearing, but very different outcomes because one is finding it fine and the other is finding it effortful. So effort has become a topic of interest because effort seems to be able to, in some way, maybe explain why some people choose to isolate themselves and not engage in challenging communicative situations, whereas somebody else has it. So I'll talk a little bit about listening. Okay. So as I said, I'm interested in speech perception, particularly speech perception when the going gets tough. We still are not able, although things like Siri and other automatic speech recognition systems are very good, they're really not good in situations sort of like this. This is a picture from a conference I had earlier this year. But you can imagine situations like this, and if there was also music in the background and the light was a little low so you couldn't see people's faces very well, it would be very difficult, right? And automatic speech recognition systems fail in these situations. When the signal is too ambiguous for the ear to make sense of it, well, for the brain to make sense of the auditory signal itself, you need knowledge and experience to help fill in bits. And for 20 years or so, my lab is focused on how we use knowledge, the kinds of knowledge that are helpful, and then how we use that knowledge to make it better. And I got into this because of this guy. This is my father, who was a navigator in the Air Force and has very marked high-frequency hearing loss in both ears. I think in the past you might have described him as deaf as a doorpost. He really has a lot of trouble, but his hearing aids help, and he gets by. But I was interested, given that one thing older people have a lot of is knowledge and experience, right? So how can older people deploy their extensive knowledge and experience to maybe mitigate some of the effects of hearing loss? And the interest started. In our studies, we typically use sentence-level materials. There's a whole continuum of language units we could use, but we focus on the sentence because it's sort of the most natural element of language. It's the element that it can express a coherent thought. So we take it as the most perhaps ecologically relevant unit of language. So we study sentences. Okay, so here's an example of how knowledge can help you. And also this example, I hope will convince you that perhaps some of our appreciation of the clarity of language is illusory. Not in this situation where the room is relatively quiet and I'm the only voice in the room, but in busier situations, if there are other voices around, you may perceive someone quite clearly, but some of that perception may be a bit of an illusion. I'll just demonstrate what I mean by that. So listen to this.
It was a sunny day. The children goes to the park.
What do you hear?
Something about going to the park.
Yeah, well done. Good. Anybody else?
R2D2.
Okay, so not even speech, really? Okay, so you heard of the speech. You didn't really. Who heard of the speech?
The second half. I could. The first half.
Not so much. Okay, I'll play it again. Well, actually, I'll just move on and I'll show you what the sentence is, and then I'll play it again. Okay. Hear this again. Let's disappear this first. Oops. Oops. Go back. Go back. Go back.
It was a sunny day. The children goes to the park.
Okay. So when you know what something is, it sounds a lot clearer, right? Presumably, for most of you, that sounded a lot clearer than the first time you heard it. And that's kind of the ridiculous extreme of knowledge, right? You knew what every single one of those words was going to be, and so you predict each one of them 100%. Now, in natural language, our prediction abilities aren't that good, right? If they were, we wouldn't have to speak at all. We could just use two. It would be so much easier. But speech is to some extent predictable because we share a common language, and there are common rules for that language, right? There's a common grammar that we use. There are words that we all understand. Some words are more common than other words. And you use all this information to predict what you're about to hear. So in the next half hour or so, I plan to go through four domains. One is exploring a little bit how different kinds of knowledge can guide speech perception. The question of whether you can attend understand degraded speech if you're not fully attending to it. And we have kind of a surprising finding here, which is that even very lightly degraded speech, it's 100% intelligible, right? You can report all the words, but it's a little bit hard to understand. If you are not fully attending to that, it's really not going in. And so this has implications, I think, for kids who are perhaps slightly hearing impaired, right? Whereas a child with normal hearing can be picking up things that they're not fully attending to. A child with even a little bit of hearing loss may not, that may not happen for them. They may have to be fully attending to the channel for that information to be detected and processed. Okay, are different challenges to speech comprehension met in different ways? And this is about a listening effort again. We have this feeling of listening effort, or people can have a feeling of listening effort, and subjectively it may be very similar, but it may be arising for different reasons. And the cognitive resources that are brought to bear to cope with the demand may be very different. And we have some brain imaging data to suggest that there may be a common percept of listening effort, but the way that your brain is responding to the demand is different for different kinds of demand. So I think of this as the engine light theory of listening effort. Listening effort is really just like the engine light in your car. It tells you there's something hard happening, but that could be very different in different situations. And finally, explore that concept of listening effort a little bit more. So what kinds of knowledge can help speech perception? Imagine we have a talker, we have a listener, and the message is formulated in the talker's head, and that talker has all kinds of knowledge, right, that helps to formulate that message. They have knowledge of the language, they know how the world works, they know how to put words together to make coherent sentences that the listener can understand. And the listener has access to exactly that same information, right? So they can use that information to predict what they're going to hear. The sound passes out over the articulators and is filtered by the articulators effectively. And those can tell us something about the size of the talker. So the vocal tract length determines some of the acoustics of the voice. We'll get into that a bit later. And so just by listening to the voice, you can tell how big somebody is, whether they're male or female. If they have a particular accent from a particular place, right, then you can use what you know about the accent to maybe help you understand what they're saying, visible speech gestures, and so on. The sound then leaves the mouth, bounces around the room, there's reverberation and echoes that get added, and there's information even at this level that can help you, right? So if you know something about other sounds in the room, that may help you hear out a target talker better. Knowing something about how sounds propagate and reverberate in the room. Okay, so those are the kinds of knowledge that can help. And this isn't meant to be an exhaustive list. This is just some examples of the kinds of knowledge that we have access to and can use. And they can help in different ways. So they might help by allowing you to perceptually separate, say, two voices from each other, right? If you're familiar with one voice, then you may be able to pull it out from the other one to hear it better. If you're attending to one thing and not attending to something else, that might affect the signal to noise ratio. So you might perceptually be amplifying the thing you want to hear and attenuating the thing you don't want to hear. A number of studies have demonstrated that when there are transient interruptions to sound that mask the sound, your perceptual system just rides right on through, right? So you might have a door slam in the middle of the meal was on the table, and because you heard on the table, you will hear the M instead of just a noise. So you can fill in. And all of these things might help to reduce listening in. Okay, so I want to talk about a number of possible sources that, just give you some examples of sources that we've explored in the past 15 or so years. I've got identity of a masking talker there, but I'm not going to talk about that for reasons of time. I'm going to start by talking about familiar voices. So how can familiar voices help us? Well, one thing we get from familiar voices, obviously, is we know who we're talking to, right? You're listening to the afternoon drive program, and you hear the announcer, and you know that guy, right? A familiar voice. But we also use familiar voices, it turns out, to help us hear better when the environment is kind of noisy. So first study that we did in this area, we used rather peculiar sentences. We didn't want people to be getting a benefit because they knew the kinds of words that their familiar friend or spouse was going to use, or habitual turns of phrase, or speaking rate. We wanted to know if there was something in the voice itself. So we use these very artificial sentences, like ready Baron, go to green 2 now, or ready Charlie, go to green 3 now. And we played 2 talkers saying sentences like this at the same time, different words in the sentences.
Ready, Charlie, go to ready 2, 3 now.
And on any trial, the participant's task was to listen for the Baron voice, and then go to the color number coordinate, like red 2, that Baron was told to go to. So you're listening to these mixtures, and then on a screen, there was a matrix of colored numbers, and they had to just indicate the colored number that went with the Baron voice. And what we saw was that for spouses, people who've been married for a long time, we got quite an impressive benefit when they were listening to their spouse, when the spouse was producing the Baron voice, compared to when a novel talker was producing the Baron voice, somebody else's spouse, actually. So that shows us that there is this benefit to knowing the person that you're at a restaurant with, right? You will understand the person across the table from you better if you know them than if they're a stranger. And this turns out to be true not just for spouses, but it's also true for friends. So this is a study done by my student, Izzy Domingo, and we see a very similar benefit. So we're plotting, as in the previous graph, we're just plotting the percent correct here as a function of the noise, of the relative loudness of the target sentence and the masker sentence. Here we used a slightly different type of sentence. So instead of ready, Baron, go to green 2 now, where you just have to indicate a colored number, the sentences in this task are all of the form, Bob lost 2 red gloves, or Pat sold 6 small shoes. And you're always listening out for Bob or Pat. And then you have to, lost 2 red gloves, sold 6 small shoes. So you have to indicate the words that Bob or Pat lost, whatever, did. So again, we see this benefit. And again, we can attribute it to the voice itself because we've removed all other information really from this communicative situation. Friends don't often say, Bob lost 2 green shoes to each other. And in order to make sure that our masker sentences were effectively masking our target sentences, we made it even more artificial because we had our talkers produce these sentences in time to a little bar on the screen. So they had to produce all the sentences in exactly 3 seconds, and the words were spaced, so there was a little tick to tell them when to produce the next word. And this was so that all the words would line up across the 2 sentences that are being mixed together. So we messed with people's prosody too here. So this is just the voice. Okay. So then Emma Holmes in my lab asked the question, given that we can use familiar voices in these 2 ways, do we use the same information from the voice? Do we listen out for the same acoustic characteristics when we're identifying our friend on the phone and when we're deriving a benefit, when we're understanding them better in a mixture of sounds? So Emma basically took the voices apart and manipulated them. We know from previous work that for identity recognition, both the fundamental frequency of the voice, the pitch, which has to do with the mass of the vocal cords, and the size and shape of the vocal tract matter for this. So the vocal tract, as I said, is the whole articulatory apparatus from the voice box, right, from the larynx all the way up, including the tongue and the mouth and so on. We wondered whether the same characteristics would matter for the intelligibility benefit. So it's kind of hard to talk about fundamental frequency and vocal tract. Well, it's hard to talk about voice characteristics anyway. We can talk about facial characteristics, right? You know, some people have narrow faces, some people have heart-shaped faces, some people have bangs, some people don't. We can talk about those visible characteristics very easily. It's a little harder to talk about voice characteristics. We can't see them. But of course, different people have very different voices. This is a picture of Julia Child, and anybody here know Julia Child? Probably, yeah, okay. So she had a kind of a strange voice.
High-pitched.
Very high-pitched, yeah, in some ways, but she had a... Yeah. So she was a very tall woman, Julia Child, and she had a very long vocal tract, but she also had sort of little tiny vocal cords. And so she had a voice that was not a very, it was a high pitch, but the other characteristic you hear that's a little different to that is because of her long vocal tract. And then somebody with a very low pitch and a long vocal tract. So if these two voices were mixed together, you'd have absolutely no trouble distinguishing them. And we encounter a lot of variability in voices, and we seem to be able to extract the content pretty easily. We know what he's saying. We knew what she was saying, despite the fact that acoustically these voices are very, very, very different things. So what makes a voice? This may be familiar to many of you. The vocal cords vibrate, and when they vibrate rhythmically. They close and open rhythmically, and that produces this spectrum of sound with the fundamental at a certain frequency, and then harmonics at integer multiples of that fundamental. And then that source is filtered by the vocal apparatus. So as you move your articulators, your tongue, your soft palate, your teeth, your lips, as you move those things, you create resonances, and those resonances selectively amplify and attenuate that vocal source to produce the formants. And the formants are peaks of energy, selective amplifications due to the resonance of your vocal tract applied to that vocal source. And so what Emma did was she messed with this. She changed the formant spacing by, she altered the vocal tract by changing the formant spacing. When the vocal tract gets longer, these things get further apart. And so that's one dimension she changed. And the other dimension she changed was the pitch. So the value in frequency value of this, and then the integer multiples, what the spacing was on the harmonics. And she also presented original materials. She shifted things quite dramatically. She used a psychophysical procedure to figure out what the just noticeable difference was for these two characteristics, and then once she figured that out, she multiplied it by 5. So it was 5 just noticeable differences away. And people were then presented with these original and manipulated voices, and they had to do either an explicit recognition task and say, was this your friend or not, for each item they heard. And the two sentences were mixed together, just as we did in the previous studies. And I'll just play these for you. So this is an original sentence. Sorry, it's kind of quiet. I don't know how to turn it up. Turn this away.
Is there speakers in the ceiling floor? It sounds like it's going to be.
Yeah, it is coming. I've got it to go out. That's right. It won't be here. I do have it to go out. I wonder what
the speakers.
Yeah. Oh, is it the knife on the wall there? Oh, lovely. Thanks. Does that work?
There's the marks here.
Okay. So that's, if you just listen, maybe you can hear it faintly. This is manipulating the vocal tract length. Oh, sorry, the fundamental frequency, the pitch.
Attention off, down, code white, all clear in unit 5. Code white, all clear in unit 5.
And this is just changing the vocal tract length and nothing else. And then this is changing both of them. Sounds a little squeaky, that one too. Okay. And as before, we had friends' voices and we had other people's friends serving as novel talkers in this experiment. And so sometimes people were having to identify the words that, sorry, their friend said the Bob sentence, and then they would have to identify the words that their friend said, or a novel talker, somebody else's friend would say the Bob sentence, and they'd have to identify the words that that novel talker said. For the recognition task, how well could you recognize, or could our participants recognize the voices as being from their friends or spouses? If the voices were unshifted, they were very good at doing this. This is a measure of sensitivity here, and 3 is very good sensitivity. So they were very good at identifying, correctly recognizing their friend when the voice wasn't shifted, and also when the pitch was changed. So if the pitch was changed, they could still recognize their friend. In a way, that's not really surprising because we do change our pitch quite a lot when we speak, right? We go up to ends of sentences, we come down on statements. And that doesn't change the intrinsic characteristics of our voice. However, when the vocal tract length characteristic was manipulated, then people's recognition was not different from chance. In contrast, people got a benefit from the familiar voice in all conditions. So the dotted lines are for performance for unfamiliar voices, and then the solid lines are for performance for familiar voices in different conditions. The black lines are for the unmanipulated. So this just replicates our previous finding that you're better at understanding somebody you know than somebody you don't.
Even if you don't recognize their voice.
Even if you don't recognize their voice. Yeah. And so that was also true in all of these other conditions. Things were a little, oops, that line should be there, great. Things were a little lower in these manipulated conditions, but everything was significantly bigger than 0. They weren't very different. So yeah, we had this dissociation where if you manipulate the pitch, people could recognize fine and they got the intelligibility benefit. But if you manipulate the vocal tract length, then people couldn't recognize, but they still got an intelligibility benefit. And the fact that they couldn't recognize kind of makes sense because this isn't a characteristic that changes in adults, right? And we haven't done this in kids, and it would be very interesting, I think, to see whether kids are a little more agnostic about vocal tract length, because in their world, vocal tract lengths do change a lot. Okay. So familiar voices provide a large benefit. The benefit in real life is probably greater. As I said, we mess with everything other than the voice. So in real life, when you're in a restaurant with a friend, you know what they're going to talk about. You know their habitual terms of phrase, you know the words they're likely to use and all that, and you know their speaking rate, and all of that is going to help you as well. We got rid of all the information here. So we have this benefit even if you change fundamental, but not if you change the form and spacing. And so this suggests that depending on our perceptual goals, we may use different information in familiar voices. We can use familiar voice information in different ways, depending on whether we want to recognize somebody or if we're trying to understand the voice. So that's an example of a way knowledge can help facilitate speech understanding. I'm just going to quickly run through a couple of other ones. I've already alluded to this one, knowledge of what will be said. So this is another example using a different manipulation than the first example I gave you at the beginning of the talk. So listen to this. I'll play it again. Very good. Yeah. Okay. So that's that's the sentence. Here it is again. I'll play this one. Right. So you hear it more clearly. We call this pop-out. And it turns out, as I alluded to earlier, pop-out doesn't only happen when you can predict with 100% accuracy what you're about to hear. If you just have a vague idea of what you're about to hear, you also get some pop-out. So we showed this in an experiment where we degraded sentences, and we preceded them with 3-word newspaper headlines, if you like. So, upset sports player. So none of the words in the text cue are in the sentence, but the meaning is kind of encapsulated, right, in that text cue. So we either presented the text cue and then people heard the degraded sentence, or we presented unrelated text cues that were actually cues for other sentences they weren't hearing, or just non-word nonsense that was completely uninformative. And we had people rate how noisy the sentence was. Now, these sentences are actually created out of noise. The way we make them, I don't need to go into it, but suffice it to say they're basically modulated noise. Noise is all they are. And we can change the intelligibility by changing the number of noise bands. So 3-band noise vocoded speech is not very intelligible. 6-band is more intelligible. And what we found for both 3-band and 6-band noise vocoded speech is that when we gave people these cues that were related in meaning to the sentence, they rated the sentences less noisy, suggesting that there was this illusion at play, that if you can predict what somebody's going to say, they sound clearer to you than if you can't predict. Okay. And this is really helpful. We use this all the time, right? This is just an example of the use of context. So not all context is in the sentences. A lot of context is visual. You have to be able to appreciate what's around you to understand what somebody's saying to you. For any of you who, I think this is particularly the case if you have young children or had young children, you find yourself saying the most peculiar things sometimes, or you hear them say rather peculiar things. So an example that I pulled from real life is, I want to eat the Grandpa Bunny's hearing aids, which if you didn't have context is a very strange thing to hear. But if you know that your kid is looking at 2 cakes, and there's a little girl cake and there's a grandpa cake, and the grandpa cake has marzipan hearing aids, then it makes total sense, right? This is, you probably don't appreciate the likeness, but this is supposed to be my father here. Okay, and not appreciating the context comes at a cost. So we have used functional magnetic resonance imaging in the past to show that when we give people sentences where the context is obscure, like her good slope was done in carrot, compared to her new skirt was made of denim, we see that left ventrolateral frontal cortex has to work harder. We see increased activity in these parts of the brain that seem to be involved in cognitive control and exerting effort, actually. When they're degraded, I should say. So that's these areas that I've circled here. Okay. So knowledge of what will be said can help. And we have this enhanced clarity when we are predicting accurately. However, sometimes predictions go wrong, or sometimes we fail to predict. And in that case, listening can be effortful. Okay. Another example, and this is a funny example because this is an example of how knowledge can hurt you. Actually, knowledge can make things harder, not easier. This is another imaging study that colleagues and I did, a couple of imaging studies actually that colleagues and I did some time ago, where we looked at sentences. We wondered how people process sentences that had ambiguous words in them. Like, the shell was fired towards the tank, right? Compared to her secrets were written in her diary. When you hear the shell was fired towards the tank, you may not be aware of any extra effort, but shell, fired, and tank are all ambiguous, right? They all have more than one meaning. And it's only by putting all of the words together, by holding that whole sentence in mind effectively, and using all of the words to mutually disambiguate each other, that you're able to understand what it means. And you do that seemingly effortlessly, but I assure you it's not effortless for the brain. We did a very simple study where we just had people listening to sentences where 50% of them had ambiguous words in them and 50% didn't. And what we saw was regions in the left hemisphere, anterior frontal, posterior temporal here in red, where the brain appeared to be more active for the sentences with ambiguous words than without ambiguous words. And these are very similar areas to the ones that we see working harder when people are not given context, when they're trying to integrate her good slope was done in carrot, when they have a little bit of noise in the background. Okay. Just for fun, I can say that these areas are also active when people hear phonological jokes compared to non-phonological jokes. So jokes where you have to resolve an ambiguity to understand. This one's for you. Why did the golfer wear 2 sets of pants?
Keep himself warm.
Because he got a hole in one.
Oh, very.
But exactly that kind of joke also results in activation in very similar reasons, and for very similar reasons, right? Because you have to be sorting out which meaning is appropriate of hole in one. Okay, so to understand natural language, we do have to resolve ambiguity. You might think that this is a rather niche thing, but if you look in any conventional dictionary, you will see that 80% of the words have more than one meaning listed. Sometimes it's a different sense, like twist your ankle versus twist the truth. And sometimes there are very different meanings, like shell or bark, right, or bank. And somehow we work this out without thinking about it very carefully. But I think we have quite a lot of evidence to suggest that it isn't that straightforward. There is a demand imposed by the presence of ambiguity in language. We have to hold a material in mind in order to disambiguate an ambiguous word. We need to use other information that's available to select the appropriate meaning and integrate it with the other things we're doing. And that's tough. Okay. Do I have maybe 5 more minutes? Okay. You could say no. Okay, the last thing I'm going to talk about is listening effort and how important it is to be attending to things that are even slightly degraded. So, how is intelligibility like a duck? I alluded earlier in the talk to a situation where we have 2 people, both of them wear hearing aids, they both perform identically on a speech intelligibility test, and then they go on to have very different behaviors. One of them is happy and goes to parties and wears his hearing aids all the time, and the other one does not. Okay. The other one is finding it too effortful. to try to engage socially, and so they stay home, they don't go to the meeting. We have a similar situation here. So we simulated something like that in the lab, where we have clear sentences and then highly intelligible but degraded sentences, but they're so intelligible that the word report, if you just play these to people, they can still report 100% of the words properly. And then a slightly more degraded condition I'm not going to talk about. I'm just going to talk about these two conditions here. So on the face of it, they look very similar, right? Performance is the same. But if you look under the water, you can see that this pink duck is scrabbling frantically, right, to try to stay in that one place. And we see this in the brain as well. So when we play sentences like this to the brain, where the intelligibility is the same, what we see is that for clear sentences, whether you attend to them or not, brain activation is about the same. We see the same patterns of activity. And we don't see much frontal lobe activity for these purple sentences. It's not very, very elevated. In contrast, for those pink sentences, we see activity in frontal and temporal areas that depends on whether the speech is being attended or not. If it's attended, then you see the activity. If it's not attended, you don't. And you see elevated frontal activity, but only, again, when the speech is attended. Okay, so there's suggestions, and I can show you a picture here. I don't need to go into this in great detail, but this area here is only active when the speech is slightly degraded and attended. If speech is clear, you don't see this. If speech is slightly degraded and not attended, you don't see this. I'm just going to skip ahead now. So what we take from, so we've done 2 studies that are very consistent in showing that pattern of activity. And what we take from them is that degraded and clear speech make very different demands on attention, or clear speech if you have intact hearing versus clear speech if you have degraded hearing, perhaps, right? If you have some hearing input. They make different demands on attention. And attention appears to gate processes that enhance intelligibility. So if there are attentional issues, or if there are attentional issues and a hearing impairment, then there's going to be communication difficulty because it just won't be processed. So even mildly degraded and 100% intelligible speech seems to require full attention to be processed in the brain, the way that clear speech is. Okay, so I think I'll make this my last slide. I've talked to you about different ways that knowledge can enhance intelligibility, and one way that knowledge can make it harder when words have more than one meaning, and you need to, those multiple meanings, and you have to figure out which meaning is appropriate. And in that case, you have activation in left ventrolateral frontal cortex around the anterior insula. I've talked about when you have very slightly degraded speech, you need to attend to it in order to understand it, and that seems to result in activity in a very similar region. And over here, I have images from 2 different studies we did where we looked at missing context. So her good slope was done in carrot, right, where you're trying to understand the meaning of a sentence and you're just not there because you don't have the context. We see kind of a similar area. And all of these, to me, I think of as, and there's a number of other studies that show that other tasks that are effortful, that require cognitive control, activate similar regions. So I think this is part of the singulo-opercular cognitive control network that's being recruited to help in all of these challenging speech listening situations. And I think that this is the engine light. So this is a sign that the brain is working harder. It doesn't tell us how the brain is working harder. It doesn't tell us what the brain is doing. And in fact, we do have other studies to show that the network that's recruited to overcome acoustic degradation is very different to the network that's recruited to overcome ambiguous words in a sentence. So when you hear a sentence embedded in noise, like her secrets were written in her diary, then superior temporal areas, parietal areas seem to come online. When you hear the shell was fired towards the tank, then it's more frontal. It's much more frontal, the areas that seem to be, and posterior temporal, that seem to be important for disambiguating. Right? So you see different responses to different demands. So the demands are different, the brain responses to those demands are different, but this engine light comes on in all of those cases. And so I think of this as a brain proxy for listening effort. And the lesson I've taken from this is that we can't be seduced into looking at listening effort as a thing, because it's not really a thing. It's a symptom of the brain having to meet demands that may exceed its resources. And that's all it is. And depending on the demands, the resources that are brought to bear can be different. So the feeling of listening effort that audiologists are so interested in is just it's a symptom of a problem. We should be studying the problem, not the engine light. So I will stop there, and I hope there are things to think about there.
Great, thank you. Questions, comments?
Other than, I'm interested in the advice that you've given to your father, other than pay attention to my lips. What other advice do you have for hearing handicap?
Well, I can start by saying my father does not take advice. He has, I can quote him here, do not give me any of that psychology mumbo jumbo. Advice, yes. Converse in well-lit rooms. And if possible, yeah. I don't know. I mean, you would be in a better position, I think, having experienced, having experience with hearing impairment to know what works best. Appreciate the context around you. If you're not sure what somebody has said, I guess, look around and see what they might be talking about. I don't know. I mean, the hope is that by studying how knowledge can mitigate hearing loss, we may be able to help people to deploy it better, but I'm afraid we haven't got to that point yet. Other than public service announcements being in famous voices, that's about as far as I've gotten.
Number two, in terms of voice recognition, how advanced, and these days of hacking and spy stuff, how computerized is voice recognition?
Yeah, in quiet, it's, for identity?
Yes.
It's very good in quiet, I think. I don't know that area very well, but my understanding is that it's very good. So you can have voice fingerprints, but they're also easy to simulate, which is a problem.
Now, for example, if you have an individual's voice,
yeah,
and then you hack the phone,
yes.
says the phone that is talking to China, that we're going to arrest that type of recognition.
I'm afraid I don't follow. Sorry.
You've indicated the sort of computerized voice.
Yeah.
Okay. Is it individualized? Has everybody got an individual voice print?
Oh, I see. Yes, definitely. Yes. You can use, and people use voice prints for security, right? So some banks and things, I think, use voice identity information for security reasons. It's a little problematic because voices are simulable. There is software I've only seen demonstrated, I've never actually seen it in the wild, that will with 15 minutes or so of a sample of your speech, then take text and synthesize it to be plausibly you, saying all kinds of incriminating things, which is.
Can somebody open up a series with somebody else's voice, or is it single voice recognition?
Oh, I see.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't have these new gadgets. But
Telephone here?
like a telephone.
Yeah.
That's before my day.
Yeah, I know we have a Google Home at home and it recognizes all of the people that you talk
Anybody.
to it. Yeah,
Okay.
you just have to identify yourself and then it knows. Now, it is not good with noise. So if we have the stereo going at the same time, it often doesn't hear us or recognize us. It has to be quiet for it to do that. Yeah.
What, I know this was done out, so I'm just trying to think, what dictates how quickly or when a voice becomes familiar? Or what factor?
That is a
I think about like
wonderful-
a teacher for a child.
That is a wonderful question, and it's one that we're looking at now. I can tell you that we started rather naively by essentially using basically audiobooks. But it turns out that if you just play people an audiobook and expect them to become very familiar with the voice, it often won't happen, because I think that voice is just being processed for the content, not for the identity. There has to be a person there in order for
Interaction.
I think so, in order for the voice to become familiar in a way that will benefit intelligibility. We're still looking at, well, we've got 3 studies on the go at the moment looking at this. It could happen quite rapidly, though. We have looked, interestingly, we have looked at teenage kids and their mother's voice to see if the benefit is any bigger than what we see there, and it isn't. It's about yeah, it's about as big as it is for. So we started. Sorry, shut your eyes. It's annoying. So we started with long married spouses. So, you know, for more than 10 years, and in most cases, I think the average was 27 years married, right? The first voice you hear every day, the last voice you hear every day, these are really familiar voices, right? And the benefit is about 10 to 15% there, or 6 to 9 decibels if you want to measure the benefit this way, right? So what you can hear in +3 for the unfamiliar voices is the same as what you can hear for your familiar talker at a -6 target to master ratio. So it's about a +9 dB advantage. And then when we went to friends, using different materials, the benefit was about the same. And the benefit's about the same for kids listening to their parents too. Yeah.
Where does the concept of central auditory processing difficulties fit into this one? Oh no, I knew I was going to do that. Okay.
You shouldn't make your speakers cry. It's so fine. I honestly don't know what to tell you. I fear to go there. I think people struggle with the definition of what central auditory processing deficit is. It seems to mean different things to different people, although there is a standard definition, but I think the devil is in how you assess it and what you think the phenotype of kids with this problem is. What do you think?
The problem is that it's all confounded by a number of things. Children with attention difficulties, right? And ADHD will have difficulties on driving processing tests. Then it becomes the issue about what's the battery of testing that you use, how do you interpret that. The more interesting part is at the end of the day, what do those recommendations look like? Does recommendation look any different than you would give for environmental modifications for a child with ADHD?
So I guess central auditory processing problems who didn't have ADHD?
Well, those are the same kids that get confused, right? They're biased, right?
But in general, do you think that they're,
not.
I wonder if they're the same thing, just looked at from different
Well,
perspectives?
your comment about a symptom versus problem,
Yeah.
right? Are we looking at the end result of, abdominal pain has multiple sources, but we're just at the end tail of it, multiple things. I wondered if on imaging, those things start to
Come
come out.
apart. Well, I think it's one of the
Auditory
great
processing,
things.
auditory
That's my
attention,
question.
Yeah.
listening effort
Does it
even.
fit in?
Yeah, that's a great idea. And it's one of the great values of imaging methods. I mean, imaging gets a lot of what the opposite of love is. It gets dissed a lot because, it can easily veer into the kind of superficially phrenological, which isn't very interesting. But for questions like, is this the same mechanism or are these different mechanisms? It's great, it's perfect. And so for trying to tease apart the task demands and cognitive resource allocation that gives rise to listening effort, it's great for that. And it might be also helpful for trying to tease apart whether you have a homogeneous group of kids or whether you have kids who are dealing with what might look like phenotypically the same issue, but in different ways. Is that what you were suggesting?
A little bit, yeah, and just one of the same effort intrigues me. Because I work with a lot of children with brain injury, and it's often becomes you tax out after with amount as the effort rises, it's kind of tap out in whether it be their attention or their capacity. So just starting to think, is it a separate thing, or how does it link to attention? And I know there's all sorts of types of attention as a cognitive construct.
Yeah.
Because the recommendations from CAPD involves a lot of the usual ADHD stuff with the hungry environment, but also one of them is the issue about the fatigability of the person, talking, trying to listen to what's going on in a very busy classroom. And so you always wonder what parts of it, we're talking about a lot of things at the same time in terms of recommendations, right? It's not specific.
Recommendations are usually pretty good. Sit close to the teacher.
Yeah, the environmental modifications stuff.
Yeah.
They're nothing different than you could say if they had ADHD.
Reduce distractions.
Right, that's what I mean.
Quiet.
Yeah.
So I have a comment and a question. So I think the familiarity thing is interesting because you said an audio tape does not come familiar quickly, but you started the talk by talking about a radio host, which is similar, except that we attribute personality to.
Yes. Yeah.
So anyway, that's just kind of interesting thoughts. But I'm wondering if you had any comment about early treatment for hearing impaired children, especially the mild to moderate, where a lot of the treatment often removes all the context, right? They mask. So given what you just presented, where clearly familiarity and context and so on really helps understand. Does that make any difference in how much
I guess it depends on what you want to accomplish with the kids. If you want them to perceptually learn what speech sounds like through a cochlear implant or through a hearing aid that's processing it extensively, then perceptual learning will be facilitated if the difficulty is a little elevated. I mean, this is one of the interesting paradoxes here, is that we also, in a parallel line of work, we studied perceptual learning for the very degradations that we're using here. And these degradations are effortful to understand initially, but as you learn them, they become easier. Your performance becomes better, and we can measure the rate at which people's performance becomes better. And it turns out performance becomes better faster if you don't make it 100% predictable. So if you give people the sentence that you're about to hear, and then they hear the degraded speech, they learn to understand degraded speech more slowly than if you make them struggle, you give them a little bit of context, and then they have to hear it again and they have to work for it. Then you see more efficient learning. So if it's learning that you want, then yes. But if it's understanding that you want, if there isn't much scope for learning, right? If they have a hearing impairment and this is what they've got to work with, then I don't know why you would want to impose that kind of a load on them. They'll just get tired, I think. I feel, I study all of this in, very nice, very cut and dried preparations. And I'm a total charlatan coming in here to give you advice because you guys know way better than I do what works and what doesn't. And it would be better to work the other way, right? Where you say, this works, this doesn't work. And then, maybe we could go and figure out why.
So when Ben was asking about sort of hearing impairments and learning to understand things, you said earlier when context is important. Do visually impaired kids take longer to learn language?
That's a good question. A lot of the context is in the speech itself. And in fact, all of the context that's been studied. So research on the effects of context, how context facilitates processing and has all been done using context that's in the sentences, or in the materials, like it was a sunny day and the children were going to the park, right? And that's the context is there in the sentence itself. And
also then to have a bright light on.
yes, but that that would be really for visual lip movements. Yeah, to help disambiguate.
Other thing, although you haven't got into infants and childhood, you've introduced really the concept of the importance of voice, and particularly Julia Childs is such a shrill, grating voice. And we talk about survival instincts of infants, making sure that the mother has eye contact. Then we thought really about the impact of voice on infants, and also the amount of voice that infants have. Okay? Talk to their baby. But the question is, how much talking is done by mothers to their infants? And that may lead, if that's insufficient, lead to pathology. And the grating voices lead to pathology. But you haven't got into that yet.
It's a very subjective thing, though, isn't it?
It's very
It's very subjective, but what is
a grating voice.
Right. Do parents with mellifluous voices have better adjusted children?
I think it's like research where they look at the hearing children of two deaf parents would answer stuff like how much voice you actually need to hear to hear language and things.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting situation, right? I mean, it's that situation where people are advocating now for cochlear implants, not for the child, but only because the parents don't sign. The parents can learn to sign, but
a hearing child of two deaf parents.
I see. Right. Sorry,
they're not hearing the parents' voice for them. I mean, they might not.
Yeah.
That's how they learn language.
Yeah.
I think they're encouraged to put the kids in environments that they teach. And if there is work on the amount of language that children learn and the difference in socioeconomic groups and the difference in the children's vocabulary, and it's higher when they hear more words. And there's 30 million word gap between the lowest socioeconomic.
But actually, I read something in the Atlantic a year or two ago with that, and how they were encouraging lower SES moms in the United States and the southern part of the states to talk more to their kids.
So they kind of mental health stuff. Yeah, they measure it and so on. So I think more like things.
I do have to say that if you are deaf parents who sign fluently, then there's no communication problem with your hearing kid, because you're hearing as long as your kid isn't blind.
And that's how the kids learn how to talk.
Right. Yeah. And
And they'll be in other environments. You still not getting the same amount of input.
No, that's
the
true.
parents.
Yeah.
The other thing I was wondering, so in order, you're saying, you have to keep in your mind sort of with ambiguous sentences and stuff, and words have two meanings. You have to keep that in mind while you're working it out. So the people who have problems learning language, do they have greater working memory problems?
What with the?
Well, I don't know which is the chicken, which is the egg.
Yeah, certainly working memory seems to be related to, people have gone through the gamut of conventionally agreed upon cognitive constructs, and working memory keeps coming out as the key for learning of language, right? So Gabriela Vilioka has this work showing that your non-word repetition span predicts how quickly you will learn a foreign language. It's certainly important for speech and noise perception. It seems to be anyways, at least the research suggests that people with better working memories are better able to understand speech and noise, probably because they can hold the bits that they're hearing in mind to help disambiguate the bits that they're not hearing so well, to do the filling in.
But that's really, because if we kind of thinking about causes as opposed to symptoms, so with kids with ADHD, who have higher rates of language problems, but is the attention or is the working memory deficits that lead to the language problems? And it sounds like you're saying it's more the working memory issues.
Well, I think some people would say that working memory and attention
Right,
are
right, separate. Yeah.
Well, your processing speed as well, and that's a big thing, because you're just taking that as an effort to try and, you're just behind all the time. That would affect the amount of effort as well, wouldn't it?
If you're slower, you mean, if you have a slower processing speed, then you won't be, things are kind of accumulating and you can't keep up.
You can't do that.
Yeah, potentially. I don't think people have found processing speed relationships with speech and noise perception, but it's confounded because a lot of the studies are done in older people who are slower in terms of processing speed anyways, and still manage to run the world just fine.
Okay, Ingrid, that was fantastic. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful talk. Good talk for you.
So next one, John and Mandy. So John and Mandy are going to talk about a child with significant late onset study who's got phenomenal psychiatric care, which is cured him of all
Still
his
stutters.
Yes, but he's had a lot of empathy directly. So that is roughly a month from now. Thank you very much. Fantastic talk.
You can get this lady in your lab.